This module discusses some basic finance issues, budgeting issues related to career and technical education. First of all, the United States has a system of education that really treats each state differently. Education is the responsibility of the states, and so we essentially have 50 different models for financing education. Every state governs its own system and decides how to pay for it. They decide how to license teachers. They decide how to allocate funds between programs, how to assess students, how to assess teachers. I tell a lot of my students it's like we're 50 different countries when it comes to education in the K-12 system. So as far as paying for it, again, different states allocate funds a little bit differently. In general, every state gets about 7% of its budget from the federal government, and that 7 or 8% pays for essentially special education services, and also pays for career and technical education. And there's a good bit of Perkins money that comes from the federal government and has come from the federal government for years to pay for career and technical education programs. The state of Ohio, for example, gets around $50 million from the federal government for career and technical education. And in order to take that money, they have to agree to match it. So they pony up $50 million of state money, and we have essentially a pot of about $100 million for career and technical education. Now, there are other monies also that contribute to career and technical education. There are other state dollars that go to districts, and also local property taxes. And most of you, if you own your own home, you know that a good bit of your local tax bill goes to pay for the local school district. So the model that we use, it's about 46% each in state and local taxes, and then that remaining 7 or 8% is federal money that helps to pay for education. The amount of money that schools receive varies greatly, and Ohio is a poster child for how this works or doesn't work. It depends a lot on property taxes. That local piece really determines the funding that comes to a school. So if you live in an area of the state or a town or a township or a county that is wealthy, you're likely to see more money coming into the district. And so local property taxes have a lot to do with the quality of the schools. So we have a lot of school districts that are very, very good and have excellent resources, and we have some districts who really struggle because the local property tax rates are fairly low. Once that money comes into the school district, there are questions that need to be answered in terms of where does it go? What does that funding get allocated for? Now, with respect to career and technical education dollars that come from the federal government into the state and then get funneled to the local, obviously that money must be earmarked for career and technical education. But those other state dollars and those local property tax dollars, they can go in different directions, and obviously they don't have to go toward career and technical education. And in our system, where the focus now is on academics, more math, more science, that tells you that we are going to have an uphill climb to get resources, financial and otherwise, to support our programs. The largest expense for school districts, because teaching is very people intensive, is salary and benefits for the instructors. And so this is a continual issue. The cost especially of benefits and medical care has gone up greatly in the past 10 or 12 years, and so it puts a strain on school district budgets when these costs keep going up. In Ohio, we have lots of different students, and I've just listed some of the different areas that exist in Ohio that fight for resources. We have regular students, if you will. We have special education students, career and technical education students, gifted students, low-income students, lots of different other diversity issues that we have to address with the resources that we do have. As I mentioned before, career and technical education has had a good history of federal dollars that actually dates back to about 1917. The Smith-Hughes Act was the first federal act that said we're going to allocate federal dollars to local schools for career and technical education. And that support has been with our programs since that time. So it's now called the Perkins Act, but it allocates about $1.5 billion across the country to states. And so, as I said, Ohio's state piece of that is about 50 million. And that's to recognize that our programs have unique needs and are expensive to operate. And it's not only equipment and supplies, but also it's instructors. If we want to hire competent instructors from business and industry, we need to be able to pay them a wage that's somewhat comparable with what they can make in industry. And that's been a challenge in a lot of areas within career and technical education. If we want to pay an automotive instructor $50,000 a year, if they're really good and they work at a dealership, they can easily make twice that. And so it can be a real struggle for school districts, for career tech districts to recruit career and technical education teachers. So that's part of what Perkins recognizes when it allocates the funds. I will say this, we've had the federal dollars for many, many years, but one thing that we haven't had in the past 20 years is an increase. It's been about $1.5, $1.6 billion since the 1980s. And we know that the costs of everything have not stayed the same for the past 20 years. So really it's been a loss of revenue. We're still working from the federal level with the same amount of money we were working with in 1980. Also, a lot of the career tech funds that are received are designated for certain things, like it can only be spent for equipment or only spent for professional development. Some of you have tuition reimbursement, or you're getting some sort of fee waiver for the class. That is, in many cases, Perkins money that the district has been given with express intent that it be for professional development. So that's where some of that tuition waiver or reimbursement comes from. Because of these constraints related to funding, we have seen in the state and across the country a reduction in the numbers of career and technical education programs. And I think that's a real problem when we look at the labor market now and the need for skilled labor. As far as a general idea of a budget planning sequence, every school district has a little bit different way of doing things, but this gives you a snapshot or an idea of how a district might do it. And so you may have your administrators coming to you at different parts of the year asking you, what do you need for next year? What are your equipment needs? What are your supply needs? And so this gives you an idea of how things work their way through the district. There are lots of other people involved in the process of approving expenditures. So again, this sequence, it's not exact, but it gives you an idea in general how the process works. Your responsibility as far as budgeting involves things like capital outlay for equipment and supplies, instructional supplies, things that you might need for your classroom, new textbooks, that sort of thing. And then also maintenance of the physical plant. Are there things that need to be repaired and replaced? And again, this might be something that's you don't have to necessarily worry about, but you might be involved in the conversation by pointing out that, hey, my laboratory needs a new garage door, or it needs some new lighting, or the ventilation system needs some attention. So that may not come directly out of your budget for your program, but it would come out of the school district's budget. So you definitely should be involved in the conversation, especially when it comes to equipment and supplies. And here again, just some things to be thinking about. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of new career tech programs, and I know some of you in this class are starting new programs, or you've been in a program that was started last year or the year before, and so you may have been moved into a laboratory space that was something else 5 years ago, and that program was discontinued, and now they've retrofitted your lab, and maybe you were involved in that conversation, or maybe you weren't. Or maybe you're in a situation now where you're going to be starting a new program, and I would encourage you to be part of that conversation if they ask for volunteers to be soliciting suggestions about how these labs ought to be laid out, because you're going to be the ones working in those. And my experience has been that architects and planners don't always have the best ideas, and it should be coming from the classroom teachers, the laboratory instructors, the people with the industry experience like yourselves. When it comes to budgeting also for supplies, these are just, again, a list of things you need to be thinking about. And in the laboratory handbook assignment, I'm going to ask you to put together a 5-year budget, a 5-year wish list of things that you need, looking at it from today and marching forward 5 school years. Where would you like to be with equipment, supplies, the structure of your classroom and your laboratory? That's part of this handbook assignment. These are just some other expenses of instruction, so you get an idea of how expensive our programs can be. And we have a lot of different things that other programs don't have to worry about. And so career and technical education can be expensive. And again, related to the maintenance of the physical plant, these are things you may or may not have to worry about coming out of your budget, but you need to be involved in the conversation and make sure that they are budgeted for. Many of you get pushed to increase your enrollments. CTE funding in some respects is based on, as I like to say, butts in seats. So if you only have 10 students and you have a very expensive program to operate, your administrators are going to continue to push you to get more students in the program. Generally there's a cap around 24, 25 students, because we don't want necessarily any more than that for safety and instructional concerns, but we also don't want 7 or 8 because we need to have numbers. Career and technical education has always been an elective form of education, and so we need to encourage our students to attend and enroll in our programs. So that's issue 1. Some of you are working in districts where you've got school levies on the ballot, and we all know how hard that can be to pass those, and we all know the ramifications, the implications when they don't pass. Programs are cut, people lose their jobs, program quality suffers. So that's an issue. And the other piece is technological change. Some of you work in areas where technology impacts what you do, and it changes almost on a daily basis. It's not too much of an exaggeration. If you're teaching an IT program, the software changes, the hardware changes. If you're in the medical or health occupations, there are new techniques and new pieces of equipment that come out all the time. So that's hard to forecast and hard to plan for when you're doing budgeting, but you have to consider it. For you, I think putting together this 5-year forecast, looking at what you have now and where you would like to be, I think that's a great idea. You have to plan. You also have to consider that you're, in a sense, competing with the other people in the building. They also have things they want and need, and so you have to be able to plan and piece things out. You're not going to get a blank check that says here's $100,000, go buy whatever you need. You've got other people down the hall from you or other parts of the building that want stuff too. And I think in one of the other modules I talked about putting together miniature proposals that have different characteristics, different pieces of information about any item or piece of equipment that you want to buy. So I think if you put those together, you stand a much better chance of getting what you want. But realize that resources aren't infinite, and you have other people that want things as well. So these are just some basic ideas related to program budgeting and finance in career and technical education.